So hello everyone, my name is Luis Martinez. I am a longevity and anti-aging medicine physician. I have clinics in Puerto Rico, Orlando, and Latin America, and Miami too. And I do a lot of cutting-edge longevity therapies, plasma dilution, senolytics, senotherapeutics, exosome stem cells, NAD, some gene therapies. So happy to be here and answer some questions on longevity, anti-aging. I'm sure none of you want to age, so happy to help with that.
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah Wendt. I'm the co-founder of True Diagnostic. We own a lab in Lexington, Kentucky, and we specialize in measuring biological age through DNA methylation epigenetic markers. So Halland gave a brief introduction to epigenetics and DNA methylation, but happy to be here as well and look forward to answering your all's questions.
See if this works. Hi everyone, my name is Nicolina. I'm the co-founder and CEO of GlycanAge. So we spun out of a research lab that focused on the human glycome and did the first study of this back in 2006. And then about 10 years ago, we realized we're measuring some type of aging. And we've shown this to be the first inflammaging clock, which is our commercial test now. But we focus on the human glycome for preventative healthcare and early detection of disease, alongside aging.
Oh, great. Thanks, guys. So thank you for sharing the intro. So obviously, I talked a little bit about biological aging. And maybe a good way to start off with, Hannah, would you like to start off with a little bit about what you think biological age is based off you guys' tests is? Because I was actually showing some results that were pretty pretty profound, right? I'm about 12 years younger, hopefully less. Could you share what you think about biological aging?
Yes. So Halland gave a good introduction to biological aging. I think it's very difficult to define biological aging. As you all may be familiar with some of the hallmarks of aging, Halland showed there were about 9 10 years ago, and now we actually have 12. So they added 3 more hallmarks of aging. So I think it's very difficult to give a firm definition, although we know from a underlying biological mechanism that something else is happening in the body while we're aging that does not equal chronological age, right? So think of how old you are. You probably know a lot of people your same age, right, that look a lot older, that look a lot younger, and that's called phenotypic variation. So we definitely know something is happening on the cellular level. So if I could define biological aging, it is another process that is happening on a cellular level, more having to do with environment, interventions, lifestyle factors, supplements, medications, procedural-based therapies that you engage in.
Great, thank you. And so how does this whole testing work, right? Because we all obviously know about, we can do simple blood tests to find out your cholesterol and hormone levels, but how does this testing now work, and what are we looking for? Are there certain cells we're testing for? There certain things in the blood? What's different? Because obviously we have 2 testing companies here. Maybe we can understand a little bit about the difference between the 2 tests as well. So Nicolina, maybe you want to give your perspective on that?
Sure. So ours is very specific, where you can look at human glycome in throughput. It's really on antibodies. And that's what we specialize in, and that's where we see aging. So really you're seeing how does the immune system age through chronic inflammation. And it has both these pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory functions. That pro-inflammatory would accumulate with age, anti-inflammatory will decline. And then this feeds into chronic disease. And it's a common mechanism of many chronic disease, but at its basis, it's aging of the immune system.
Perfect. All right, great. And Hannah, do you have anything that you want to add on that? Or maybe even talk about how did you guys come up with sort of your format with testing, and what are you seeing in terms of taking action on these type of results?
Sure. Again, to add to maybe the definition of biological aging, aging is very, very complicated, right? Extremely multifactorial. So you can really have a biological age clock for almost anything. They used to measure biological age way back when by how many cigarettes you smoked, which is a really, really crude metric. And we're going to continue to develop ways to look at aging. So True Diagnostics specifically looks at those DNA methylation markers, which genes are being turned on, which genes are being turned off. And I think in creating these types of clocks, there are a lot of things to consider. So first, training the algorithms for a particular outcome. And that can get really biostatistical heavy, but essentially the end goal is for it to be the most predictive measurement of other health outcomes, right? If it's not clinically applicable, unfortunately, it won't add much insight, and you won't be able to do much to see an effective change. So I'm sure Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chen will talk a little bit more about the applications and utility of this in the clinic. But I think first and foremost, you have to train it, you have to validate it, you have to make sure that it works in other populations, other ethnicities. I think secondarily, then it has to be very precise. So if you take, a sample twice, ideally they should be identical. That's not always going to happen. There's going to be little variations of error that add up over time. And then again, I think adding back to it needs to be changeable. We need to be able to affect that in the clinic.
Great. And Dr. Martinez, what do you think about this whole biological age? Is this something that affects the way you practice? Do you incorporate it, or is it just another data point? How do you view this? Is this
Totally, yeah. So it's very, very interesting because right now, I feel we are at a crossroads in terms of aging as a disease and what we're doing with it. Now, and I'll explain why. Have any of you seen that documentary on the blue zones? Everyone, of course. It's like, yeah, if you haven't seen it, you shouldn't be here. What's interesting is we have all these, these blue zones, very longevous people in different parts of the world. Here's something that maybe you may have or not realized watching the documentary, but the longest living people on the planet right now don't go to doctors, don't measure, don't take pharma, don't take drugs. They just live long because of their lifestyle, their nutrition, all that. Now, my point with all of this is that we know, based on these blue zones, we know how far we can go on that alone. But the problem is, or the challenge is that right now we are doing a lot more interventionally. We're doing stem cells, we're doing the exosomes, we're doing plasma dilution, we're doing senotherapeutics, we're doing a lot of things that are really pushing the envelope. And the only way to really understand the impact of these therapies is looking at biological age. That's really the single biggest factor there for what are we going to do. So we need that in terms of measuring and following our patients. And the other thing really important is that irrespective of the actual objective data, biological testing can do something very important for patients, and that is give them motivation. I have seen patients that, just take care of themselves, do their weekly or yearly checkups and all that, and they feel fine. They say everything's fine when it's probably not. When we look at their age, biological age, suddenly they, hey, you're 10 years older biologically. That can be such a motivational component for patients to really take their health seriously. So I think it's the objective component of interventional strategies and the motivational component of doing something more proactive for your life.
Great, thank you. And maybe we can cover the testing process and open floor, whoever wants to take it. What does it look like when we're testing biological age? Because we see so many things about scanning or sampling. Is it saliva, stool, blood? What does it work? How does it work? And what happens to that sample once you get it?
I'm happy to jump in.
Okay.
So our sample is blood. We used to do plasma and serum, so you can only do this from frozen plasma 10 years ago. So when I did my first biological age, which was 8 years ago now, I walked into lab, gave blood, and about 6 months later, a PhD student gave me the result. So that's how it used to be done in our case. And then we managed to transfer it about 5 years ago to dry blood stains. And with dry blood stains, of course, you have the impact of postage, of different temperatures, so we had to test it on all kinds of different conditions. And we do every analysis now on the dry blood stains in triplicates, meaning we run it 3 times to make sure there's no variability. And that's why our error margin is less than a year. So when you see a year change in your biological age, it's already a significant change. But we specifically analyze glycans, and I haven't actually explained what they are because they're so complex. And they're not very popularized, but glycans are complex carbs. But what you probably don't know is that they define your blood group. Glycans and blood cells give you a blood group. They're why our cells communicate. They're why we became multicellular. This is how our immune system communicates. Also, they enable every single biological process, things that you wouldn't think of, like conception, happens through glycans. Sperm would code itself in a certain glycan, which makes it seem friendly to the female immune system, so that you can enable conception. So every single process goes down to glycans, but we know very little about them, and where we understand them is the immune system.
Right. And so, obviously, with Hannah, you guys are measuring more methylation. Are there similarities between these two, or it sounds like these two testing, one's measuring glycans, which is more carbohydrates, yours is more methyl groups on DNA. Are they similar or are they different, or how are they similar and different?
Yeah, and Nicolina, you can add your comment afterwards as well. I would say they're probably very different in capturing completely different biological ages of the body. So again, going back to the idea, aging is the #1 risk factor for most chronic diseases and death. We absolutely have to measure it, but we're aging in all sorts of ways. So maybe the biological age that you receive from glycan age is going to be different from that of true diagnostic. And I think that's really confusing to users. So we can talk about those differences between tests as well, depending on the outcome which you want to receive. But both are correct. Both are going to be scientifically validated. With the DNA methylation epigenetic markers we look at, we have a wide array of algorithms that have all been published, scientifically validated, publicly available. So Dr. Chen showed one that was, he was 12 years younger, I think, on, so that's more of an overarching biological age. We have things like pace of aging, Dunedin pace, you may be familiar with, we created with Duke and Columbia University. There's also telomere lengthening that we can interpret from DNA methylation outcomes as well. So DNA methylation in general just looks like a really great biomarker. We can get a lot of different outcomes. But again, most people I would say hear of true diagnostic through that biological age aspect.
I think we had a question that says, what is the size of the database?
So it's all going to be different. It's going to be very algorithmic specific regarding, how do you train the algorithm? How are you validating the algorithm, right? So that does get more into the science. Regarding true diagnostic, we've been around for about 3.5 years, and we've tested about 35,000 people.
And so a lot of this, correct me if I'm wrong, it's in reference to other data metric points, right? So when we're actually figuring out my biological age, it's because we actually have 29-year-olds whose DNA profile looks like mine, right? Is that how that works?
Yeah, it's very important to add on what Nicolina was saying about using a blood-based sample to measure glycans. You have to use blood with DNA methylation. There are a lot of consumer-based tests out there that use saliva, but you have to be able to relate these to outcomes. So how can we do that? We can actually go back and look in biobanks from people who were very, very young, right, looking at their DNA methylation markers, and then when they grow up, what diseases, what outcomes, even when people die, right? So then we can identify what those markers may look early to receive that specific outcome. So they don't have saliva-based biobanks. If you know one, please let me know.
Okay, great. And I'll ask this the same question for Nicolina. So what is the difference between a little bit more about methylation and glycan age? Because even glycan age is pretty new for a lot of the people in the longevity space, but it sounds like it's a bit complementary because we're learning different things. Is that what's happening?
I think it's pretty new because just generally the lack of awareness around glycans. And then also if you look at the field of epigenetics, you have now, I'm guessing, but 100,000 people who are scientists who are specializing in the field. In glycobiology, you have a couple hundred.
Right.
You can put them all into a small football field in the high school. So that's one of the key differences in awareness. But also they measure completely different things, and there has been studies that compare them, and they do not correlate. You can have a completely, like your epigenetic age could be 40 and your glycan age could be 20, and that's perfectly normal. But when you compare them on outcomes, there was a recent comparison in a biobank called the Scottish, I actually forgot, I think it's the Generation Scotland, yes. And they had mortality data in the biobank, and they compared performance of the epigenetic clocks and the glycan clocks, and they looked at grim age, which is the best mortality predictor. And glycan age and grim age were equal at predicting mortality. Although glycan age was never modeled on mortality. We've always said, for the last 10 years, we've had the same algorithm. We haven't changed it. And the reason we got to the algorithm is that we realized that glycans change with age, and we were studying disease. And we could not study disease without knowing age of a patient, because you can have a young person who has a profile of who has a disease and looks like a healthy old person without a disease. So there is this mechanism behind it.
So let's talk about these aging clocks. I think people have heard of the ones that you had mentioned, Hannah, but can someone maybe explain to the audience, like, what is an aging clock and what does that mean? Because that might be quite significant, right? Especially if you're getting life insurance and, you're, let's say, 40, but they say you're 60. They're like, oh, this is a guy who's at high risk of passing away. Like, how did this all come about? What do aging clocks actually mean?
You want me to answer
that?
Yeah,
or we can have whoever.
So yeah, and the aspect of epigenetics and DNA methylation, the definition of an aging clock would be looking at really just one or more, or I should say two or more, DNA methylation markers. And again, we're training these to predict outcomes. So the more data we're able to feed it, the better it's going to be. And there are different clocks. This is where it can get a little bit more complicated, called first generation, second generation, and third generation. So first generation clocks are actually getting closer and closer to your chronological age. All they use is the DNA methylation markers with chronological age data. You all probably know your birth date, and we're very fortunate to know that, but these clocks were first used to identify the age of DNA on crime scenes to see if refugees were old enough to seek asylum, so they still had specific applications. Fast forward just a couple years ago, we now have these second generation clocks which use underlying biological information. So we actually just released our new Omic M age created with Harvard that outpredicts even grim age, noted as the old gold standard of biological age tests through DNA methylation. That actually outpredicts it for every single disease and death. And that was actually powered by clinical lab values, proteomics, metabolomics, transcriptomics, genomics. So again, the more data you feed these algorithms, the better they're going to perform. And the last note on that is there's a third generation clock option, which is more of a longitudinal clock, which is interesting. It's probably one of my favorites, but it's telling you how quickly you're aging at this very moment in time. So it's really great for N-of-1 precision-based medicine. Regarding research being limited in this field, I think it's a really good clock to measure, things that may affect your biological age or that you want to test personally.
Great. And so because you guys have probably seen a lot of different aging and aging clocks, each of one, if we go one by one, what has been your personal experience, or at least from what you've seen in the data or with clients that you work with, rapidly cause aging, and what are some things that you've probably seen maybe correlatory help decrease or slow aging?
I want to start? Yeah. So the first point there is I think it's very important for everyone to understand that, chronological age is a fixed upwards process. You can't bring back your chronological age. But biological age is extremely dynamic. Extremely dynamic. You can have a patient one day get a test, and that's good. And they can have, 10 years younger. If they deteriorate, they don't sleep, stress goes up, they gain weight, inflammation takes over. That can rapidly change. So that's why we have to, and that makes perfect sense with the differences that we can see between epigenetic clocks and glycan age. I mean, just because of the whole rate of aging and the fact that different body tissues and organs can age differently. Depends where, where there's inflammation, where there's disease and all that. Now, interventions that I have seen improve, especially I do a lot of the epigenetic testing, and I'd love to get more into the glycan age. We'll talk about that a bit more. But epigenetically, I have seen really interesting results with, for example, therapeutic plasma exchange, plasmapheresis, plasma dilution, has seen knockoff, 5-10 years in patients with multiple sessions. Peptides, we use a lot of different peptides, great results there. Some of the regenerative medicine-based therapies, the exosomes, the stem cells, and the senolytics. So I've definitely seen improvements with all of them. What makes someone age faster or go downhill faster? It's really the whole lifestyle. I mean, it's chronic stress, poor sleep, weight gain, bad nutrition. It all comes together. So yeah, definitely. But we know what's going on and how we can modify this.
Okay. So how can you change your biological age? So I'll put the difference in what we have hard scientific evidence on and what we have individual case studies on. And what we have hard scientific evidence on is weight loss, caloric restriction, different types of exercise like HIIT training in the form of sprints would lower your glycan age, estrogen post-menopause. So we see that in menopause you have accelerated aging. It's more than double the rate of usual aging, and this can be prevented and even reversed with certain types of HRT. Estrogen in men, also testosterone converts to estrogen, and we did a trial where if they get replacement, you see them not have the acceleration if you block testosterone and then replace it. But if you block the aromatase, so it doesn't convert into estrogen, you see no beneficial effect. So it was also the estrogen in men that had a beneficial effect.
How soon do you see that, by the way?
How soon do you see it?
On the test.
How soon does it change?
Yeah.
So the half-life is about 3 weeks. So if you're seeing for a full change, 8 weeks minimum, and we would say 12 weeks post the therapy. There's interesting new evidence on young plasma. So we just, a week ago, published a study in rats, not in humans, where they're taking young porcine blood, putting it into rats, and this was looking at both epigenetics and glycans. So it was the Horvath clock, and Horvath was one of the key authors. It reversed 50% both clocks.
Wow.
This is very rarely that you see the same intervention have an impact on both clocks. But of course, this is very early on, needs a lot more evidence. I don't think it's quite ready for people. Then when you think of how does this individual impact me, what should I be doing? Because these are all very generic interventions or radical therapies that are not quite ready for people yet. It should be anything that's healthy for you. And it should be very individual, because for your glycans are regulated by your genetics, your epigenetics, your environment. If you're responding to something, you're responding as an individual. And we don't have, for example, we have very little evidence on mental health. We know that PTSD will accelerate your age. If you have PTSD, on average, you're 15 years older. And we can tell responders and non-responders to depression therapies. But for me personally, the only thing that spiked my age in 8 years was a trigger of a childhood trauma, and then resolving that. But we have absolutely no hard scientific evidence in that. And I would love to start collecting it.
Great. Okay, excellent. So, I mean, obviously there's so many ways to measure aging and testing. I mean, is this something that do you guys view this as a mainstream thing, or is it still, do you see the adoption being slower? What are your thoughts and feelings of that? I mean, should this be part of mainstream medicine?
I'm biased, but I definitely think it should be. I've seen actually the adoption phase starting to pick up. When we started doing this a few years ago, I was a bit like, what are you guys doing, or what's the utility, whatnot? But I think as more data builds and we get more evidence for this, and as we educate more physicians, clinicians, healthcare practitioners, that we're very involved in physician education. As we get more people on board, they understand the value in doing this, and we can add to the database. We can track more data, see how the interventions are responding. So I think it's actually picking up speed, and I really believe that, again, there's different alternatives, but I definitely believe that integrating biological age into anyone's program, health program, wellness program, is a must. You guys should know that. I tell my patients, if you know your chronological age, which you do, you should know your biological age, okay? Yeah. And track that as you proceed with interventions.
Yeah, I still think this is very new science, right? We all have to understand that first and foremost. Regarding epigenetics, the first clinical interventional trial actually came out in August of 2019, right? That's 4 years ago, basically. That's the TRIM trial. For those who may be familiar, they used DHEA, metformin, and growth hormone, and they saw a reversal in the first-generation Horvath clock. So again, a first-generation clock. We want to see more reversals in the second generation or even the third generation. And just to relate it back to Wonderland and the conference, we do a lot of clinical trials at True Diagnostic, and one in particular that we just finished doing was a ketamine trial with Wild Health clinics, and they're located in Kentucky as well. And we didn't necessarily, I would say, see many great changes in biological age. We didn't see anything negative, but we didn't really see anything positive either. But what we really noticed when we did a deeper analysis is we were actually able to see gene expression changes. So post-ketamine therapy, we were able to see stress mechanisms in a better light. So I think, again, all that to be said, the research is very new. We're actually understanding maybe not only what affects biological age, but how it's actually affecting the genome as well. We are. We mainly work with healthcare providers in the integrative functional medicine space, like both of them right here. So they are taking a lot of the GLP-1, semaglutide, tirzepatide, retatrutide, and we're tracking that data.
Yeah. So kind of the interesting part about these tests is that it seems like the level of innovation and how you can adapt these tests to make changes might actually happen more rapidly than what we're seeing in the conventional medical world, right? So what we see in, like, for example, let's take, for example, lipids, right? LDL, we now know there's apolipoprotein A and then B, but that's actually not even common, even though it seems common to our world, but I think just because we're familiar with it. But that's been a big pivot shift. Even insurance companies don't cover it. Do you think, is this something that an insurance company you think would cover? Like, what are the costs associated with this type of testing, and is that worth doing if your insurance company doesn't cover it? I know it's a loaded question. I asked like 5 questions in one. So number one, how rapid can these tests evolve? I mean, I know that you talked about there's a version 3 of this clock, but like, are these tests things that like you might have data, but then 2 years later you could rerun my sample and tell me something new?
Yes, absolutely. Do you want the insurance question answer?
No, we'll leave those guys last.
We'll leave those. Insurance should definitely pay for this, but this takes time to convince insurers. Yeah. So the other question was how?
The other question is how rapidly can your test evolve? Like as time, like for example, she has a great question about GLP-1. So essentially people who've obviously heard about Mounjaro and all the stuff that you can lose weight. There might be some good things, there might be some bad things, right? We're not going to find out till later on, but it's not like there's a test that you can see to monitor it, right? I mean, I'll share an example. I have a client, they had lost weight, but their stomach doesn't empty anymore, and so they always feel bloated when they eat. Kind of sucks, right? So how would you know if you had the susceptibility unless you had a test that could get rapidly evolved? And I typically see innovation happen in privately held companies versus you might be at a Quest or a LabCorp, and they're like, we don't offer that test. And so I guess my question is, how agile is it to develop your algorithms based off of new therapies that come out?
So this is dependent on how fast is the science moving, and then also how quickly are you getting it into clinic and you can make actual clinical claims. Mm-hmm. And the science generally moves slowly. So we stumbled on to aging 10 years ago now. We've studied cardiometabolic diseases for 15 years now. We are just now unrolling the first application of it, which is more like a genomic test, where you have a reference to a paper saying, here you can read about the evidence, but we can't yet make a medical claim. Mm-hmm. Now we're only in the process of going for European regulation to make medical claims, and then you have to do it market by market. So it's the usual time frame of from when you establish something in science to when it's actually applied in medicine is about 14 to 17 years. So yes, of course, you can move quicker as a commercial company because you have a different type of funding mechanism. Grants are really slow. So we are now unrolling products where we can give you disease associations. But again, it's like the genomics. It's not, you can't use it for diagnostic purposes, but we can reference to the evidence that we've accumulated in the last 15 years. And that took us 3.5 years to commercialize.
That's much faster. I mean, what I would say an interesting example is if you take 23andMe, for example, that was pretty regulated where they couldn't tell you what diseases you had, but you actually could take that data and upload it into this other website based in the UK, and they could tell you. So even if we couldn't tell you in the US, your DNA is your DNA, right? And so I think what's interesting is that depending on the regulatory system we're in, essentially having more data seems like, well, having more data is better than not having the data. And so I think the interesting component is that we're now actually looking at things that are considered non-typical blood markers, but they're actually, they've been there all along. We just didn't have ways to measure them. So.
I just wanted to add to that. I think, again, we're going to see like an exponential increase because one of the things is there's been a huge growth and interest from venture capital. And of course, the science follows the money. If there's funding for a lot of this stuff, it's going to go in faster. There's a few entrepreneurs out there doing some really interesting things, right? So I think that's going to happen. Insurance might take a little longer, but it's always that way.
Yeah.
I tell patients, don't leave your health in the hands of insurance companies, right? Take action and do it for yourself. So, yeah.
All right, and we have 3 minutes left, so I wanted more of an experience share. Last question is, what does longevity mean to you, and what is your number one thing you do to help extend your life?
I'll go first. Again, longevity is very complicated, you all, right? This is the underlying theme. I don't think we can quite define it yet, along with biological aging, or this functional medicine space is doing a great job of addressing it as closely as possible. For me personally, and I've talked about this before if you've ever heard me speak, it's definitely stress. I am a ball of stress, and we absolutely know that stress can accelerate the biological aging clock with the DNA methylation. So we've seen for clinical trials, things like meditation, breath work, whatever does it for you, whether it's reading, writing, taking a walk, are all recommended. And what, Dr. Chen spoke with showing the pillars. I think one other really interesting study, which is probably intuitive, is caloric restriction. So I practice daily caloric restriction, about 10% overall caloric restriction in healthy non-obese adults, published by Dr. Daniel Belsky out of Columbia in Nature at the beginning of this year, the end of February. So that is the only really proven clinical trial to show that we can slow those clocks down. Only third generation as well.
So for me personally, it's the lack of disease, mental health, because if you do not feel good about yourself, if you don't love your life, you're not really going to enjoy being around for a long time. Function, being as functional as you were when you get younger, as you were younger, because that's the main thing people complain about as they're getting older. And the two things I focus on personally, and this is just for me, it's different things for different people, it's gut health and mental health, and these two are very connected.
Doc?
Yeah, for me, so longevity, it's a lot of things, but definitely pushing your health span as much as possible. And obviously, it's going to translate into lifespan, also increase, but interventions, again, there's a lot. I'd love to say pick a lot of them, I do, but from a caloric restriction perspective, we know the science is there. I prefer, at this point, it's easier time-restricted eating. So I think that's a really easy intervention for a lot of people to do. And the other thing I would pick is really exercise. Just keeping those muscles, at an advanced age. Getting to that age and you still have muscle mass and keeping that muscle mass, I think that's huge. So those two things.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing all your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Learned a lot.
Thank you.